because of all that, I don't want to belabor a lot. I do want to kind of just first I'll say, like, I'm actually really excited to talk to you. You popped up in my TikTok feed, and I think that's an interesting place to start. So I don't know how familiar you are with me, if you had a chance to watch any of my stuff.
I've watched a little bit. It's quite high production value. I don't know how I'm gonna fit in here, but I wish I had my usual setup. I'm currently out in Brighton. Sorry, I'm just turning off my phone. I'm currently out in Brighton because my grandfather's sick, and I'm just kind of checking in on everybody over the holidays. But
No, this is
yeah,
actually ideal. I prefer, generally speaking, it to feel more candid and not feel as
okay.
produced when I talk to people. That's
Am I
kind of
sounding loud enough? Am
oh
I
yeah,
am I too?
no, you sound good. You sound good.
Okay.
It's funny. I don't know, because you said you're in the UK. Are you familiar with Tom? Oh crap, I'm gonna fuck up his name. Tom Nicholas.
No.
He's part of my general space on YouTube, and Nebula actually. He just did something about why YouTubers are holding their microphones, which, like, arguably speaking, the average professional YouTuber should be able to afford. Like, I have an off screen, or barely off screen, directional microphone, but I
Mm.
always put it in my shot. And that's partly because there's a aesthetic around things feeling more organic and unprofessional.
Yep.
But you want to mix that with polish and production and stuff. So it's a long story. So this is great. I say all to say this is
Yeah.
great. So yeah, I talk about a lot of things. I'm known for different things to different audiences, but one thing I'm known for is kind of my analysis on the manosphere and masculinity. And so that trickles into the way algorithms view me. So in TikTok, which is separate from my YouTube algorithm, TikTok, I guess, finally figured it out, and then you pop up, and I'm like, oh, this is excellent, because I don't want to get overly political. I'm going to get political in the actual video, so I don't know your overall politics, right? But you clearly have a strong kind of, like, what's the word I want to say apolitical, but it's like even tempered analysis on manosphere adjacent ideology and talking points, things that a lot of people say they want to understand about men and masculinity, but they don't. It's hard to find people that are actually speaking from one, research-based, academia-based knowledge, and two, not foaming at the mouth, uh alpha male type people. It doesn't hurt that you look the part, right? So there's a lot of interesting elements to that. Like, immediately when I saw you, I was like, this is really interesting. One, that the algorithm fed this to me, but also two, that this exists. And as far as I can tell, I may be the first person within my realm to, like, uh talk about you, or like or even try to get in touch with you, when in
Mm.
reality, expect as once this releases, unless somebody, like, either more is coming, or after this releases, more people will be talking about you within the manosphere, anti-manosphere realm, if they aren't already in places I don't see.
Mm. Okay.
I don't know if this
I'm
makes sense.
dreading this. I'll let you know that I keep saying to myself, because really, I mean, I'm a researcher, and I just like sticking to. I'm not a particularly. I think you picked it up correctly that I'm not a particularly politically savvy person. I don't really have strong opinions about hardly anything. I hate to say. I
Mhm.
just kind of look at what's true and false, and a lot of the things that the manosphere, that's a very general term,
Right.
but I'll just say that a lot of individual points that are common in the manosphere I have issues with. And so I just say when they're wrong and try to cite the research that backs why I think they're wrong. And this has generated a bit of infamy in that group. And I keep saying to myself, I'm like, that's the last time I'm going to talk about these guys. It's not exactly music to my ears that you're going to give me more attention in this space, but you seem like a nice guy, so I'm making an exception to my hiatus from talking about the manosphere to talk to you.
Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate that. And I think even that is really interesting, because I think what you're speaking to is part of the thesis of this video, which is there's this algorithmic but also like kind of maybe intellectual draw to conversations around, this nebulous group and these issues. And part of that is because there's such a huge gap. Like, so I mentioned that I am also a trained academic. Um,
Mm.
and I remember, being in my sociology classes and feeling very limited in like the scope of like studying masculinity in my gender studies classes. The masculine scholarship that I, at least from the circle I was in, had access to, felt like it was very incomplete. There was definitely very almost nothing with Black men. Um, and so like there is a hole that I think we're filling, and then maybe by filling this hole in a non-academic space, it will uh motivate academics to, reflect back onto like what we're talking about, and provide more academic rigor behind it. I'll never forget telling my graduate advisor, one of my graduate advisors back in 2014, that this incel thing and this Gamergate stuff is going to be a huge deal in the next, like, going forward. And I want to write my thesis about that. And she was like, "You want to write it about video games? I don't get it." And I'm like, "Look, you're not seeing what I'm seeing." And then a year later, Elliot Rodger, like literally, I'll never forget that conversation. Um, so yeah, I guess let's start with that. So you're correct to say that the manosphere is nebulous. But they're all, in my opinion, tied together by a general disposition toward, gender, feminism, and then like lower on that, and from my perspective, lower on that totem pole is a genuine, like is the genuine engagement with masculinity and addressing men's issues. They kind of, and from my perspective, they kind of like use that as a undergirding to try to legitimize what they talk about and do. But for the most part, if you look down at, if you go through the average manosphere, alpha male podcast, whatever guys releases that they put out on social media, most of it is woman gets owned by logic and fact stuff. And then like somewhere in there is maybe something towards men. And then like it's of dubious intellectual or like research based quality. A lot of it is like, if you don't masturbate, you'll get superpowers, like stuff like that. So what pulled you into content? And were you even aware of like the the economy behind this? It sounds like you're aware now, and you're like, let me back up out of this before I get
Yeah.
stuck.
You're right to identify that there is a strong anti-feminist, and this is not coming from me. This is coming from my peers in my kind of same cohort, age cohort of researchers. The PhD student Louis Bichaud, William Costello, who I attempted to introduce you to. A lot of my knowledge about the manosphere from an academic perspective comes secondhand from them, and then also secondhand from my lab. I've never done any research on the manosphere directly, but my colleagues, Rob Brooks, my supervisor Candice Blake, they've done some research on incels. So a lot of the things that I'm going to say about the manosphere, it's coming secondhand from them. On the generalizations about the manosphere, it's really a multi-headed beast, right, that we're dealing with, and they disagree with each other pretty relentlessly. I would say that is a strong point of agreement, the anti-feminism thing. Mm-hmm. And the only exception that I can really think of are some of the men's rights activists. Some of them actually come into men's rights activism through a back door where they're super feminist. And then they're like, hey, these gender roles don't just harm women; they also harm men. And then they become men's rights activists as a result.
Yeah.
And they would consider themselves, they would identify as part of the manosphere, but that would be very different from, a virulent, misogynist, extremist incel. And that's not to say that all incels are that way. That actually would be inaccurate. But there are different groups, and there are different people who can appear in those groups. But I would agree with that generalization about them, certainly. Then there are a few scientific concepts. Again, I do come at this from a research background, there are a few scientific concepts that there would be almost universal agreement across the manosphere. Things about, women's mating strategies being dualistic, women being hypergamous, right? That's not a phrase that we use often in research. It sometimes appears.
Mm-hmm.
Some ideas like that are quite common among manosphere groups, but other than that, I mean, there actually is a lot of disagreement. Now, how did I become interested in them? It's more just that I'm a researcher who talks publicly about some of the same topics as them, right? So they love talking about psychology from an evolutionary perspective. And I'm someone who researches human behavior from an evolutionary perspective. Now, I'm not an evolutionary psychologist, but, a lot of work in
Neither
my
are
general
there.
orbit. Sorry?
I'm sorry, I say neither are they.
Yeah, neither are they, right? But a lot of my work is kind of around, and a lot of my lab's work is kind of around topics that they find very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens? Well, I start talking publicly about these topics, and you noted that I look the part. People have one of the funniest repeated comments that I get is I'm just terrified for every time one of this guy's videos comes up. I'm just waiting for him to say something horrendously sexist. I don't know what it is that's passing across that image.
There's a
But
well, I'm gonna hold that comment because that's actually really something I want to talk about. I wanted you to finish to put a pin
yeah,
in that.
yeah. But well, I'll just wrap up very quickly then, so we can get to it. Is just that I'm talking about these topics, and I'm kind of obtaining my own attention for talking about those topics, and then I go on these podcasts, and they want to ask me what I think about, specific manosphere talking points, such as how important is body count, right? Why do women cheat, right? Things that the manosphere finds very interesting. In some cases, things I've done direct research on. So, and I'm happy to disagree with them where they're wrong. And I'm happy to say, hey, that actually, they generally think something that's true there, when they're right. Right. I don't have an issue agreeing or disagreeing. And then from there, I went viral a few times. Apparently, I popped up on your TikTok for things that are frankly just me saying negative things about specific manosphere points. And then once that happened, well, then a bunch of manosphere people were kind of interested in me as a character, and I did two rather public debates against people who would be generally in the manosphere, although not necessarily specifically definable in any one group.
Right.
And I guess all of that kind of culminated in me accidentally being one of these characters. But I'll tell you what, it's such a I'm less interested in it than ever, because it's such a
Ooh, I know
it's
that
like
face.
you can't play with the pigs and not expect to get a little muddy yourself, right? Like, I feel like it has not been good for my credibility even to argue with these guys, because if I argue with these guys enough, I just become one of the kind of characters in their ecosystem. And then also there's this kind of, I don't know, general, you don't want your entire message as a person to just be standing against something. And I would rather stand for positive things than just stand against negative things while offering, no alternative solutions to the problems posed. So that was a very long-winded way of wrapping up quickly.
No, but that was
Please
all
talk as
that's
much as you
going
want.
in. Like we may talk for an hour, and usually if I talk to a person for an hour, I get all of 5 minutes. I got to figure out where to put that all that you just said. This may end up being a podcast as well. It's just
That's
letting
fine.
you know.
Yeah, that's fine.
Because like I agree with you so strongly for so many things you said there. So to kind of give my story, I stumbled into YouTube fame, YouTube success, I should say. And I had a similar treatment where if you are the way, and this is, this is a point I'm going to realize I have to talk about. The algorithms, I've also spent a lot of time like researching these algorithms. I'm in contact with, researching people in that world, literally the YouTube algorithm guy I know personally at this point. and they don't like to admit this, but the algorithm is incredibly myopic in how it views people, and or is incentivized to spread myopic views of their content. So the viewers are trained to see a guy that looks like you and even a guy that looks like me and say, oh, this is about to be some alpha male podcast stuff, because we look the part. We're presenting traditionally masculine images to our audience, not
Hmm.
in a cynical, for a cynical reason, just because this is how I tend to want to look. You know,
This is how I happen to look.
this is
There
how
was
I happen.
no, there was
Yeah.
no decision making.
Yeah, right.
What?
There's signifiers, right? Like I grew
Yeah.
out locks years ago because locks within Black culture signify certain aesthetics and ideology. Some not, like, it's not a universal thing, but that
Hmm.
signify. Like if you, there's a running joke that, like, I know like 10 other creators with locks. They all have my same politics. You know what I'm saying? We
Hmm.
all look alike. So there's that, and so there's that, right? And then you made a really good comment that you become a recurring character in their ecosystem. And that's what happened. You went viral. You presented and so much of the man. Oh, I didn't finish telling my story. So because I had those features, I was a traditionally masculine man. Um, I'm also married with children.
Hmm.
And it was very clear I have certain politics. My politics are very overt, and mostly through almost all my content. So it was like, oh, you need to talk about the manosphere. That was like a very early thing put on me. Like, no, you have to talk about these guys. And I'm like,
Hmm.
do I really? Do I
Well, you
like?
also had some academic expertise through studying Gamergate. Surely that puts you're probably in a much better position than me to talk about these blogs.
To an extent, yeah. Like it, likely, yes. So that was one of the reasons why I did it, because it was made clear to me that there was a responsibility
Hmm.
based on my position and the position I was attaining to do it. Um, and uh, and then there's also the financial incentive, the success that comes and the notoriety that comes from it. But it still felt icky. If it wasn't for Kevin Samuels's adjacent rise, I probably would have never done it. But I was very frustrated by how he had come to dominate like the image of Black masculinity online, that I was like, I
Hmm.
have to at least take a shot at addressing this. And ironically, he died in the middle of making the video. Um, uh, so my video, though, I'm very proud of the fact that of all the manosphere, anti-manosphere videos, and this is not to poo-poo the nature of debunking and presenting alternative understandings of these phenomena. My goal was mostly my research is always on understanding this phenomenon better. Not so
Hmm.
much, here is the data that proves that X is wrong. Because I'm sure, as you've realized, no amount of data will change some of these guys' minds. Like no amount
Yeah.
of,
And
of
then
research.
oftentimes it's not. I'm a real believer that all facts are friendly, and oftentimes it's not that their idea is wrong. It's just that they're where they go with it, right? So the underlying facts are actually correct. It's just where it's taken, right, to make them, in a black pill case, to make them
Mm-hmm.
bitter and nihilistic, or in a red pill case, and not in all cases, to be clear, but to, even they themselves talk about something called red pill rage, right, which is when, a male takes on these red pill ideologies and becomes very resentful towards society and towards women, right? So even they acknowledge that this is something that happens. And it's really, for me, it's not always the facts. It often is, but it's often the interpretation of the facts. And so I think what it sounds like you're doing, it sounds like that's much more important. Because for me, I mean, the manosphere, I'd say that they just view me as an annoying fact checker, right? Not someone I don't hear from people who are like, oh, you rescued me from the manosphere. You really, pulled the wool out from my eyes. No, I'm just kind of a dorky scientist who's saying, hey, actually, what you said 6 months ago, that wasn't backed by data. That's, you know, yeah.
And that's, yeah, and that, but that's super, that makes you super dangerous though, One, because I'm assuming your gender and sexuality. I'm assuming you're a guy that's into women, right? And
Yeah.
you look the part, like, and you're a former boxer, correct? Or
Yeah,
you've
yeah.
you've
These are
trained in
all
boxing.
these are all things that they dislike about me.
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
because it is a overt rejection of their narrative. So
yeah.
you're smarter than most of them, right? I resent the idea that these are not intelligent people because it takes a lot of intelligence to build effective misinformation, in my opinion.
Yeah, and some of them are very smart guys. I don't think
Yeah,
smartness necessarily has any moral valence, right? You can be a
right.
very bad smart guy, and you can be a very good
Idiot.
unintelligent person. Yeah.
But being in this, because I have similar, I get similar challenges. So being the narrative that they've built out of, I'm going to get granular here, out of the like mid 2010s SJW era, feminist era, is that, the soy boy framework and concept, right?
Yeah.
It's a bunch of blue haired feminists and their soy boy, boyfriends whom are cucks and they're dominant with submissive, etc., that are always against us. But then I pop up and you pop up, and I have a peer named Foreign Man and a Foreign Man, Bahamian man who does Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. So,
Mm.
so it's like, okay, clearly traditional markers of masculinity are not attached to this ideology as categorically as you think. Um, which is again why, like, the understanding part, like, okay, well, where does this come from? You touched on a lot of his economic precarity. There is a reality and truth to hypergamy and what you call it, dual.
Yeah, the dual mating strategies, and we can talk about there's some great research out of my lab from Candice Blake, my supervisor, um, on the economics of inceldom, right? Which I should send you, frankly, because I
Please,
know that these
yes,
topics interest
yes,
you.
that's
And
exactly what.
basically, to give the long and short of it, it seems that incel activity rises with income disparities because mating competition is more intense when some men are millionaires and some men are broke, right? I mean, I'll have to pull the paper up, but it's that, then also operational sex ratio. So basically, where men have limited economic opportunities, and where there are too many men, right, you'll see more incels.
Mm,
Because first off, if there's too many men, then it's musical chairs, the mating market. Most people mate monogamously, and so most people aren't sharing, and so most people are going to be taken off the market as soon as they choose someone. And so that means that if there's too many men, there are going to be more men, even if all of them are perfectly marriageable, let's say, and that's not
mm,
necessarily going to be true, then you're going to have more men excluded from the mating market. And this is going to get more intense if income inequality is super high, right? If scarcity is abundant at the lower end, because frankly, it's very hard to compete on the mating market as a male if some men are millionaires and some men are broke. Now, we don't just compete financially; men also compete in terms of their looks. They compete in terms of their personalities as well. That's not often talked about, but frankly, some men make great boyfriends and are super fun to be around and super positive and good company.
yeah.
And some are, intolerable and abusive, right? So there's all these ways that men compete. But so I'm not a reductionist. I'm not saying it's just about money, but money is going to be part of it, of
Right.
course. I mean, how could it not be?
And it's
So
probably the most easily quantifiable.
it's
Uh,
very hard to quantify the difference between Brad Pitt and I won't name any other actor, but yeah,
yeah.
quantifying differences in looks in a population is much
Right.
harder.
Or
And on the on the
especially
on the
personality as well, like even more
yeah,
quantifiable. Oh, or
yeah, and
less
and I'm not
quantifiable.
sure that there'd be as much regional variation in those traits, frankly. Maybe there is, maybe there's not. But trait inequality, income is one that can get pretty dramatic, but personality, I don't see what would exacerbate that per se. I guess just one more thing you know on the subject of me kind of looking the part. Having thought about it a little more, part of it is also that I don't look the part, right? In the sense that a lot of people, and I think this criticism is inaccurate, but they comment under my videos that the reason that I'm not red pilled, right, or I'm not black pilled, is because they perceive me as a man who is very attractive to women, right? And so they assume that, oh, he's just never struggled with women. Women have always treated him well. And so he hasn't become a bitter sexist like us, right? And, there's some empirical data that backs the idea that when men struggle with women, they tend to become more hostile towards women, right? It's not a super counterintuitive concept, just the idea that, look, if you're constantly getting rejected by women, you might build up some resentment. So that's one thing that it's more in the black pill sphere than the red pill sphere. Black pill being, so for listeners, I know that you would know about this, but for listeners, black pill is more the incel side of things. Red pill, not so much.
Right.
Red pill would be closer to pickup artistry, but not quite. That's another kind of separate faction. Although these factions are, they have a lot of overlap, as we discussed. But especially among black pill individuals in my comment sections, they tend to basically just see me as not credible as a result, because they perceive me as a good looking man. Right. And then some prominent red pill guys, have said the exact same thing about me. They've said, look, he's a good looking dude, and so he'll never know what it's like to struggle with women. And that's not, that's not accurate. I think I've had a pretty normal mating history, but I also don't really, what am I going to do to pull out receipts on that? I'm going to recite, I'm going to recite all my heartbreaks
Right,
to
right.
prove that,
Here's the
I
amount of
have string
news.
check.
Here's a graph of all the news I've received from women between 2009 and 2022,
Right.
and you can see there's a clear line of fit
Yeah,
here.
right. Yeah, there's no way that I can prove that, things have been going poorly or
I got
not
called
poorly.
a high tier normie in a video the other day, which I was just I got called a Tyrone Light and a high tier normie.
I think that's flattering. I would take
I
that.
realized it was flattering, but it was also
Yeah,
like, yeah, like
they're pretty harsh. They're pretty harsh with their ratings. Yeah. I've been called a dark triad, Chad Light. They think that I'm a narcissistic psychopath. I don't know where they got that idea, but in any case,
it's so interesting how anti-scientific this community can be, and like quietly anti-scientific, right? Um,
depends selectively.
yeah, selectively, yes, very
Yeah.
selectively anti-scientific. Because like one thing I do want to get across, this will be kind of the next thing I want to hear from you, is I don't want to say we don't take incels seriously. Is that's not exactly how I want to put it, but one argument I made in one of my videos is that, listen, if you sit back and you actually read incel rhetoric, they have a very strong, very useful frame of analysis on like sociological phenomenon when it comes to mating. It is not, like, obviously it's all covered by this umbrella of misogyny and anti-feminism, but they have a strong class analysis. They have a strong racial analysis. They have so many strong frames of analysis. It ends up being frustrating to see, like you said, where they take it sometimes. Um, what are people missing? What are regular people who are not incels, who are for most part anti-incel, whatever? What are some things that they're and by incel, I'm also speaking to the greater manosphere oeuvre, right?
Okay.
What do they not know, or what are some misconceptions that people have that are hurting at a minimum their analysis, let alone, in my opinion, the fact that there's a large chunk of these young men and boys who are genuinely in danger, like this is not a frivolous online space to be a part of. I would say from a public health standpoint, it would be a obvious what's the word? I should know this because I took the classes. It would be an obvious marker for like indicator of bad health outcomes to be involved in this type of activity if you just look at it, from there. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I'm just thinking because it's frankly it's such a great question, but it's also such a deep one. I'll start with incels because there's just better data on incels. This is one kind of peculiar side effect of committing terrorist attacks as a group, is that research on you will get funded in minutes. And so
That's
we
true.
just have better data on incels versus, we also have some people who've worked very hard to collect that data. Again, I mentioned Costello, I mentioned Blake. What do we know about incels that would be surprising? I guess I'll start with what I found surprising in first, because the media says one thing about incels, and then social media says another thing, but then research often says a different thing about incels. One thing to notice, which is just interesting up front, the stereotype of incels is that they are a very white, right-wing, violent extremist group. Okay, let's look at all the data that's been collected on this topic. And consistently, it seems that incels are actually less white than the general population. So over 1 in 3 incels are non-white in US and UK samples, right? That's an overrepresentation compared to the general population, right? In the combination of those countries. Another thing is that they're stereotyped as right wing. I would say that that is broadly true of the manosphere in general, right? But it's not as true of incels, right? I don't know if this has changed, right? One of the problems with trying to keep up with these online groups is that they can shift. Who knows where, you know, the incel voting block will go in 2024.
Right.
But the plain truth of it is that what we have suggests that this is an ethnically and politically diverse group across many issues, right? That said, some stereotypes about them are true. Again, we talked about misogyny, incel mythology, incel rhetoric, incel posting. It is, you know, pretty viciously misogynistic in many cases. Sometimes it's more implied, right? But it's very hard to read through. And, you know, some people have said, look, how much of this is trolling, right? This is a group that likes to mess around. How much of it is actually reflecting underlying beliefs? Kind of hard to know, right? But if you go through any incel content, you're going to come out the end saying, oh my gosh, that's the most sexist stuff that I've read in my life, right? So that stereotype, I'd say, is accurate. Another idea that I would say is accurate is the kind of, oh, this is and again, this is coming to me secondhand, but from people who have done real research on it, the idea that they're, you know, basement dwelling, statusless men, right? That also seems to be an accurate stereotype. They're disproportionately likely to be, you know, neat. So not, I think that's basically they're not doing education or training or employed, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if that term is slang or if that's like an accurate technical term.
Yeah.
But basically they're disproportionately likely to be, you know, young men living with their parents, right? Who are struggling on the mating market. So that's all to say in summary, some of the things that you think about incels are not true. This idea of them as a right-wing white supremacist group,
Right.
that's just not
Those
accurate.
those are the most bombastic figures within the
Yeah.
community.
Yeah. And then I remember one incel basically saying this is passed to me by William Costello, who I hope you get a chance to talk to, although he's hard to pin down.
Yeah.
He said something along the lines of, we're equal opportunity bigots, right? In the sense that, like, yes, we make jokes about race or whatever, but they do so at the expense of every race, and it's a group that's more diverse or less white than the general population, right? So some incels are definitely white supremacists. That's absolutely accurate. But some people, especially in the mainstream media, will classify them that way. And, you know, I have no issue classifying a group that way if they are. It just doesn't seem to be an accurate depiction of the group, right?
It might. So for one, I would argue that there's almost a purposeful distortion of what white supremacy is in the States, regularly speaking, probably in the UK as well. It pays, for lack of a better way of putting it, pays to implicate white supremacy uh, in any way possible that is very separate from normative white identity and ideology. So
Mm,
it pays to make the white supremacists incels and, racist police, KKK, yada, 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 in order to kind of absolve regularly functioning white supremacist structures from the damage that they do on day-to-day
mm,
life. White supremacy likes to make itself invisible everywhere except for the places furthest from the actual institutions that manifest it. So that's definitely something um, I would bring up because I would agree. I definitely know a lot about the overrepresentation of Asian American men and not so much black men, but they're very much still there.
yeah.
From the research I've done, Asian American men tend to be overrepresented, and I think that correlates with the way that Asian American masculinity has a unique form of marginalization as a minority group, whereas black men and Latino men are hypersexualized.
Mm,
South Asian men even sometimes hypersexualized, depending on the region.
mm,
Whereas East Asian men, and still some South Asian men, like Indian, and I don't know if that's the appropriate term. Uh, you have these caricatures, on TV of these like asexual, hairless,
mm.
one of a scholar that I studied under, Dr. Rosalind Chow, did something that may be of interest to you called Asian sexual politics. And hairless, sexless, something. It was a phrase
Mm.
that she had came up with about the way that Asian men are often represented to kind of remove them from essentially competing in terms of masculinity with white men. The political thing is also interesting because I wouldn't talk to a manosphere guy the other day, and this is the only section of the manosphere I talk with because they're very left wing. I don't know if
The
this guy would
incels.
well, they wouldn't call themselves incels. To me, they're very obviously incels.
Mm,
But that's my judgment upon them. But they're definitely manosphere. These are black manosphere figures, uh, and they are inarguably much smaller than the right wing black manosphere figures, like a Kevin Samuels, who many people don't know was a registered Republican
yeah.
and Trump supporter.
Or Fresh and Fit, Myron,
Fresh
and
and fit. Well, so fresh and fit. So
I actually don't know if Myron's black. I have no idea, but the two of
Myron,
them are
yeah, Myron is, I think, Sudanese, which in America would make him black by most um framings of race, but they're not black manosphere, technically
no,
in the
there.
technical
Yeah, it's a
speaking.
separate thing. Yeah,
Yeah, the
it's
black
interesting,
man,
isn't it?
yeah, the black manosphere has an explicit body politic of pro-blackness. Even in their like some of their pro-blackness is very conservative and anti-black, but it still masquerades as pro-blackness versus the general manosphere where Myron exists. Um, Andrew Tate, who is technically of African American descent, etc., they take a very race neutral or overtly anti-black stance. It starts getting into the weeds. But I
Well,
was
I'm glad you're welcome to get in the weeds because I'm glad you're talking about it. I get comments on my TikTok every day. Um, you can actually scroll and see this where they're like, talk about race, talk about race, talk about race. And I frankly, it's good. Well, just because they want to hear my takes on the Asian thing you mentioned, the discrimination against Asian men on the dating market. They want to hear about the hypersexualization of black men and women, right? And I think that people, this is one problem, is that I think that people hear me talk with, a high level of expertise on female infidelity, and they don't realize that I studied it for, over 2 years, and I went to Oxford and did a dissertation on it, right? Like
right.
it takes a long time to get to a level of any expertise where it's worth sharing your opinion. And
Mm.
then you take me slightly out of my comfort zone, and I'm as good as anybody with access to Google, right?
Yes.
So it's not that I have anything against talking about these topics. It's just that I believe it takes months of study, in some cases years, to have an opinion worth sharing on basically anything. And so I would be happy to talk about racial discrimination in dating, and I've been reading more on it. But until I've read enough to say something new and interesting,
And I
No way. So
and
I'm glad
when
that
it
you
comes to
mentioned.
black folks, I would still tread lightly. You might want to run it past me first. I did a whole
Yeah,
video on the Black Manosphere. It's almost 3 hours long.
yeah.
And you would probably find it interesting because it kind of breaks down a lot of things unique about that particular aspect of this realm. And you bring up something interesting that still kind of brings it back to the main purpose of the video, which is the the proclaiming, not just proclaiming, but anointing of expert because of the camera and the
Mm,
ability to speak intellectually. I recently got some pushback for not talking about Palestine. So I'm a leftist guy, yada yada yada. And so, like, there's an attention economy, there's a kind of social control measures for any in-group out-group dynamic, right? So being of my size and not having really said anything about Palestine, I get from a baseline standpoint of how this works, why for some that was like, hey, why haven't you said anything? And I put a message out. I don't know a lot about this conflict. And it would be weird for me to Google a bunch of stuff and then to a platform of several 100,000 people be like, here is what you need to know. All the things you don't know about the Palestine-Israel conflict
yeah,
by me, a black guy from America who was not Jewish or Palestinian, and Googled for a week and a half to present you this video. Join the Patreon, like, share, subscribe. Like it's
yeah.
there's
Yeah, well,
there's
I'm glad to hear that you're, able to stand strong on things like that, because I think there's just too much. As soon as you get, as you say, the anointment of expert by the camera, it's like people want you to talk about everything, and it's like you really shouldn't want my opinion on most topics. It
yes,
is as good as yours, and you won't process it as good as yours. You won't process, like, it really is. It's as good as your doctor's opinion. It's as good as the guy behind the convenience store counter's opinion. It's as good as your waitress's opinion. It's like they're all of our opinions are equal on topics where none of us have gone to school and studied it for ages, right? So to ask me about, let's say, the racial dynamics of the manosphere, it's like, okay, well, there are people who are studying that, right? You
right.
should go ask them.
You should ask them,
Yeah,
read their work.
yeah.
Yeah, so the attention economy, the social media economy, the content creator economy incentivizes people with I saw a great TikTok the other day. um and I love that my TikTok is like fine. I don't know what happened with TikTok. I don't know, like it died. My algorithm died for like 6 months. It was just
Yeah.
sending me all kinds of trash, and I was like, yeah, I'm done with this app again. And then suddenly within the last like couple of months, it was like, oh yeah, this is you. Here's like here's weird stuff. Here's ADHD circles and dots, and here's like intellect. Anyway, so
Yep.
this really great TikTok was basically a guy debunking this Hollywood, not Hollywood, but this like media caricature of like the snarky intellect, like House. You know what I'm saying? Like Dr. House, where you said something wrong. Well, actually, da da da. And he's like, no, like really learned and intelligent and academically like people with academic accolades. When you say something wrong, the first thing they do is recheck everything that they've ever learned about that thing to make sure they're not wrong.
Yep.
And then maybe they'll correct you. But like first they're going like there's so much trepidation. And but the economy incentivizes the opposite. And like had you if you wanted to be go full sale full sale, wholeheartedly into content creation as just the manosphere fact checker guy, you could have a lot of success, but you would have even more success pairing that with a bombastic, know-it-all, snarky
Mhm.
approach. That would get you even more attention in the attention economy and spread your message even further, um, because of how it works. And then the flip side is opposite. These manosphere guys like again Myron and Fit or Fresh. I don't know which one is which. The other guy that barely talks. And that's like so indicative of what's happening. They're fresh and fit. But when people say fresh and fit, they're basically only thinking of Myron because
Yeah, well,
Myron
they're thinking of
has,
Myron Gaines.
yeah,
Yeah.
you're thinking of Myron because he's had the most viral moments, mostly because he said something incredibly stupid, right?
Yeah.
That you know, and therein lies, I guess, part of the goals of this video is to like take a larger snapshot of this phenomenon as not just a skirmish between opposing views, but also as a systematic an economy, like an unnatural economy built out of the attention economy. You know, when you
Mm.
have certain features, when when you have a good look, you have a good voice, when you can speak intellectually, you can do almost whatever the fuck you like, right? And so you have to make the conscious decision to not overstep your expertise and acumen, which I guess if you don't actually have any, or you haven't been trained, like going through academia, half of academia is making sure nobody can prove you wrong, right?
Yeah,
It,
academia is just the process of, I mean, at the higher level, not at the undergraduate level, but as you get through it, it's just repeatedly getting humbled and embarrassed for thinking you know something.
yes,
So, and then just the practice of research, it makes you so skeptical. Because, you know, even doing things like peer reviewing others' work, it kind of helplessly makes you more inclined to fact check yourself.
yes.
Because, you know, you're suddenly, you know, you've got a paper on your desk and you're just seeing all these flaws with it. And then you're like, oh my gosh, like,
Somebody said this to me.
well, yeah, it's like, okay, I have to catch these, but oftentimes they won't be caught, I guess is what I'm saying. So
Yeah,
the whole process of academia really, I think, partially safeguards against it, but not entirely. I mean, a lot of academics they start to, you know, they start to buy their own product,
mm.
and think that because they're so used to being treated as an expert on their specific specialties that they can talk about anything.
I'm not
And
going to
that's
name
just,
drop Jordan Peterson here, but
well,
I
yeah, I mean,
immediately think
he
about.
actually is, he's actually an excellent example of that someone. I actually don't know what his specific expertise is, but this is
Yeah, you don't
someone,
even like that's so wild. That makes I'm not sorry. It
yeah, I
makes
think
perfect
it's
sense that you
Jungian.
don't know
Yeah.
because he's and I've made this argument 100 times, and of course, you can argue facts with manners for people, and it doesn't matter. But he was a psychologist. Um,
Yeah, I think he's a clinical psychologist, and I think he has some specific expertise in Jungian psychology, which
mhm.
is not something I'm particularly familiar with. But he's someone who will very confidently talk about anything in the behavioral sciences, and he's a very compelling speaker. I mean, some people who don't agree with him, frankly, will say that he's not a compelling speaker and say that he sounds like Kermit the Frog or whatever. But the truth, and that may or may not be true. But the truth is that he's, he's obtained his position for the reasons that you described, which is that he's very good at speaking intellectually. He's obviously a smart guy in terms of just raw ability to use his brain. And he has, this very striking look as well. He kind of looks like you'd imagine a psychology professor to look like he kind of looks like a philosopher.
He's
And
leaned
so when
into
he
it
talks
recently
about,
too with his fashion choices, where he
well,
kind of looks.
that's post Benzos. He's gone off the rail
I think
with the
that's
fashion
made him.
choices. He's dressing like the Joker.
Yes,
I've seen him
I
pop
actually
up
think
on
it's
my,
amazing. I wish he wasn't so noxious and harmful because I love the idea of weird, smart people.
yeah.
The idea of a Jordan Peterson existing that only was just out there psychologist and not like this anti-trans, subliminally racist right wing guy. I would be a huge fan just from a
Just for the
but
aesthetic.
just for
That's
the
funny.
aesthetic, yeah,
That's funny. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't know that much about the guy, to be 100% honest.
Whatever you do, don't
I
start
do
making content
remember.
about him, or you're gonna
I
be.
do remember that when he spoke, I mean, people say that he was past, that he's kind of past it fame wise.
Mhm.
He spoke at Oxford a couple years back when I was a student there. The line stretched through the entire city. It
Mhm.
was unbelievable. People were camping out to hear the man speak, and that was, after, the fall, so to say. But it is interesting because it seems that, I mean, I'm not, again, I'm going to speak, and maybe this should be edited out because I am going to speak completely out of school here. It does seem interesting that, like, Peterson came along and then just as a pattern, and then he was rejected completely, right? And then replaced by someone much worse, frankly, in Tate. And so you wonder, right?
So I wouldn't say he was rejected. I would say that things are cyclical. We
Mm,
operate in 3 to 4 year cycles of peak notoriety, especially within. This is actually, I'm happy you said that because it makes me have to think about this. Um, with the manosphere in particular, it's very cyclical because, for lack of a better way of putting it, and you tell me if this is that this is a theory I hold that I don't have data on, but I'm dying on the hill until I see good data. Most of the people that run in these manosphere circles that come to it, that are in your comment section now, they're more than likely just in a phase of life where this is
yes,
possible.
I would say that
Um,
that's true.
yeah, that you catch them 15 to 20 to, like, I don't know what the age group is, but because it actually probably could span a bunch of ages, but it's still, in my opinion, a like 6 month to 3 year churn, right?
Yeah, I think it's highly unlikely that you can be. I mean, the phenomenon hasn't gone on long enough to know whether it's cyclical. I mean, it's sure it's kind of existed for a couple decades, but in
Mm-hmm.
terms of it being hot, it's only been, about half a decade. I will say that there seems to be there is some evidence that people migrate between groups. So one interesting idea is that people seem to have moved, incels seem to be former pickup artists. And I guess this goes back to a question that we never really fully fleshed out. You wanted to know who these manosphere blokes are, and I gave a pretty thorough answer on incels. We don't know as much about the rest of the manosphere, but one commonality seems to be that they've struggled with women, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I spoke to Louis Bichaud, who's he seems to know everything about the manosphere. I mean, he's certainly read enough. He's read millions of words of their content, and normally in a non-academic circle that would be terrifying.
Yes.
But in
My
an
thesis is
academic
on
circle,
school shooters. My thesis, the way I came to this research was,
so you're reading
I'm
manifestos
reading
and
manifestos.
yeah,
I'm
and
still
which
in there. Yeah.
in a non-academic context, it's terrifying at the dinner party. But in an academic context, you become the most interesting person in the room.
Uh,
In any case, he's read quite a bit. And what he says is, and this might be more qualitative than quantitative, but you get kind of two groups. You get the young men who don't really know what they're doing with girls, right? Or don't really know what they're doing with women, depending on their age. And this is again why one of the reasons why I've been kind of rejected by that group is that they assume that I've just had no trouble with women ever, right?
right. Right.
So they had trouble with women, and then they went online looking for help with women, and then they found pickup artists, that kind of thing. And if it worked for them, then they ended up becoming cynical red pill types who are trying to game all their
Right.
relationships. And they actually say that term, right? I really, I don't try to misrepresent them. That's an accusation that I get a lot. I really do try to listen to them and understand what they're saying. They try to hold their frame in relationships. They try
Mm.
to I would say be manipulative. I don't think they would use that term, but they do at least try to manipulate how they present themselves to the women in their lives, right? I think that would be kind of the typical pipeline of those who the pickup artistry kind of works. They might go deeper into it,
Right.
and start looking into things like game and female mating strategies and things like that, which are
I
partially inspired by evpsych. And then the other group goes to inceldom, right? If it doesn't work, and this is part of the reason why incels, again, we're talking about the unity of the manosphere as a concept. incels hate pickup artists,
Mm.
right? They see them, they call them grifters, right? They call them manipulators, and they basically say, look, you're trying to game us out of our money by telling us that we can get women, but look at me, right? Like, and I have people accuse me of hating incels. I would encourage people to listen to my, 2 hour podcast with William Costello. It's probably the most sympathetic piece of media,
Mm.
piece of, popular media towards incels that has been published. Not saying that I support the misogyny whatsoever,
Right.
but this basic idea that it's tough to be unloved, regardless of why, totally can get behind it. That sounds like a really difficult situation. And
Yeah.
then on top of that, I totally understand when they go to, social media and people tell them, oh, just be nice, right? And you'll be able to get a girlfriend. And it's like, well, for some of them, that's certainly true, right? I think that for some incels, it's certainly true that if they were less misogynistic, right, and less mean spirited, that probably would solve their dating problems. But a huge portion of them, much more than the general population, have autism, which makes it very difficult. And I know that word has been used, it's been turned into basically a slur, but I mean, like,
Yeah.
actually they actually have autism,
Yeah.
right?
Actually on the
Um,
spectrum.
yeah, and that makes it difficult to date. A lot of them, about a fourth of them, are what we would call very high dark triad,
Mm.
which also doesn't. That's not a choice. You don't choose to be a Machiavellian narcissistic psychopath, right?
Right.
That's something that kind of happens to you through the collision of your nature and your nurture and your general environment. That's not particularly appealing to women, except in some contexts. And then a lot of them are, frankly, it's tough to be an unattractive man, right? Like, it's legitimately tough. People say that looks don't matter, but in empirical studies, looks really matter. They really help. And a lot of these guys are, below 5'6". Their facial attractiveness, it would be rated as very low by a majority of women. Some of them, unfortunately, have have facial injuries and disfigurations that make women very uninterested in them. And there are women with these problems too, right? I'm not saying that this is a uniquely male problem. I'm just saying that the idea that this isn't a tough position to be in, even if many of them are bitter misogynists,
Two
and
things
the
can be true
idea
at
that they could,
once.
yeah, and two things can be true at once. And to make it three things, the idea that their problems are easily fixable, right? I see these guys on Twitter and it's literally, oh, just be yourself. And it's like, it's easy for you to say be yourself when, you're a man of average income, average height, average looks, and you just were yourself and you got a wife, right? Um, it's much more difficult when you were the kid who was bullied all their lives, and was always unattractive to women, and never obtained any form of status, never got a college degree, that has autism, has a personality disorder. Yeah, it's hard to even know where to begin in terms of helping them. So that's my. I've obviously said enough critical things about the manosphere in the past hour. That's
But no, I
one
want
one.
that as well. Like I made a video called "What Really Is Desirable" or something like that, and I engaged with a lot of like general pop research around desirability, mostly to kind of disentangle the core goal was to disentangle the idea that you have to be this Chad in order to be desirable. But when I got to the end, when I was like, okay, so what do regular guys do? I was like, oh. And I didn't have a lot to offer. I almost left. I wish now I would have left. I'm probably going to start this video with that critique of myself, because I basically, the best I could do is say be yourself as best as you can.
And I think
Because,
that's a very intuitive thing to say, because who
right.
else are you going to be? I would say,
No, I
I
want to
mean,
hear what if you could rewrite the end of that video from a research standpoint, for that group we're kind of talking about, that like if we could look past misogyny, if they have a moment to like detox from having been in this misogynistic space, they'll be maybe a better person to be around, but they wouldn't have increased their opportunities at dating much. So the next step would
Yeah.
be, okay, what do we offer those people, those young men and older men?
Okay. Well, let's get started. I guess I mean I have to begin with, I haven't seen your video. I'm sure that you did a much better job than you're representing. I have a hard time imagining that you did a bad job. So I'm probably going to say some of the things you've said. But so you're asking how advice for people who are involuntarily celibate, right?
Right.
I would say first, I would just note that they won't like hearing this advice from me. I appreciate that I've had whether their version of it is exaggerated. I think they have an exaggerated perception of me. I mean, this is a group that's been quite familiar with me, for better or worse. I think they have an exaggerated perception of how easy a time I've had it, but I won't deny that I haven't had particular trouble, right? Even if it's not their kind of Chad fantasy that they make up in their head.
Right.
So I recognize that I'm not the best mouthpiece for this advice. Really, the person who should be saying this advice would be someone who has gone through it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just going to go from a cold research perspective. None of this comes from personal experience. It's just what can you do? Well, the first thing is something that they already know. They have a term for it. It's called looks maxing, right? I'm not going to be someone who says that looks don't matter. They do. I am going to be someone who says that you can actually improve your looks substantially, a lot more than most men think. So people tend to have this perception that your personality is what you can change and your looks are what you are doomed with, right? I kind of think it's the other way around. I think making a
Mm.
modification to one's personality, and that's a very uphill battle, and this is a critique that I got from Alexander from Date Psychology, who's a very smart guy who thinks about inceldom quite a bit. He's a researcher as well. I think that changing your personality is quite hard. Changing your looks is not easy, but surprisingly simple, right? So for men, for example, the best physical predictor in terms of, consistency across studies is frankly muscularity, right? So in terms of being more attractive, I'm not saying that you should be, max out as a bodybuilder. I'm not saying you
Right.
should hop on gear, but I am saying that the difference between a man who regularly goes to the gym and a man who doesn't, that's an enormous difference in terms of their bodily attractiveness. They make fun of it. They say, gym sell this, gym sell that, saying that it doesn't work. It does work to an extent. Then after that, it's pretty basic things that you would expect. Getting your hair sorted, right? Figuring out what haircut suits your face. And that's a very long process of trial and error.
Mm.
But you can spend the time, working on it until you find something that works, getting feedback from people. Engaging in little things such as skincare, teeth whitening, making sure that your hygiene is immaculate. There's really no excuse for that. I've known people who I would consider, they wouldn't identify with the label, but they would, consider themselves involuntarily celibate in the sense that they would want to not be virgins, but they are. A lot of them have appalling personal hygiene. And so fixing that's helpful as well. And then after that, it's kind of making sure that your clothes fit and match. If you're shorter than average, wearing shoes that compensate slightly. I mean, my girlfriend thinks I'm like 6'4". Okay, I'm 6'1". I wear a nice pair of boots and I wear sneakers with a chunky sole, and I spike my hair up a little bit, right? Again, they hate that because they're like, Jesus, he's 6'1" and he's height maxing.
He's cheating for height max. Like, what are you doing?
Yeah, he's height maxing at 6'1", but I do believe that that beauty is an important, it's important socially and it's important for your romantic relationships. But they already know that, and they're pretty good about I don't think that incels would have a bad idea of what they need to do. It's just a question of what they do in terms of their looks.
Right. It
Now, in
becomes
terms
this
of
kind of gross. They
yeah.
kind of like grossify it, for lack of a better way of putting it, instead of it
Well, they like
becoming.
to say that looks are one of the classic things of the black pill is that looks are the only thing that matters. And they point to these behavioral studies, which show that looks do matter quite a bit. And I'm not going to refute those studies, right? Yes, looks matter a lot on the mating market. They matter a lot on dating apps. They matter a lot in speed dating studies. They even matter a lot in vignette studies, right? Where we write a biography of different, this isn't research I've done, but you write biographies of different men and you present them with, different photos of varying attractiveness. And the biographies range from being just completely appalling, you'd never wanted to go on a date with this guy, to being very, very attractive biographies. He's a fireman who volunteers at the animal shelter and has a trust fund, right? So there's this whole variation, right?
And it correlates with
well, what they do is they mix it up. So you bring in different groups and you have them rate the attractiveness, the dateability of different guys. And depressingly, the biographies don't matter as much as the photos, right? The unattractive photos are discriminated against, even if the biography is good, right? And it's not just discriminated against by the women looking for matches. I believe there's even research showing that their mothers discriminate as well. That when it's like, who do you want your daughter to date? They also choose the handsome ones, right? So there's a lot of research. There's a lot of depressing. That's just one study, and people can pick on that one study if they wish. But there's frankly a lot of there's frankly a lot of research on the importance of physical attractiveness, and I'm not going to deny it. However, it's not the only thing that matters. Personality matters as well. And in terms of changing your personality, if you're one of these, if you're someone who is involuntarily celibate, personality traits are quite stable. If you have a mental health disorder, you can seek treatment for that, and that will make you more attractive, right? If you have a mental health disorder, you can seek treatment that will make you more attractive. Autism, there might be some therapeutic interventions to make it less likely to be your downfall in the mating market. I appreciate that that's a very tricky one. And then this isn't going to be one that they like to hear, but hostile sexism is very unattractive to women, right?
Even women who are like anti-feminists to themselves still don't want you to be like a virulent misogynist.
Yeah. I mean, there's a complex conversation to be had around benevolent sexism, this kind of chivalrous approach. It's much harder to say that that's unattractive. In fact, some research indicates that it is attractive, but hostile sexism, right? Disliking women, right? Viewing them as objects, right? Resenting them, debasing them. That's going to hold you back on the mating market. Surprise, right? I hope you're sitting down to receive the news. If you're listening to this, I hope you're sat down somewhere, because I don't want you to faint. But the news is, if you're a hostile sexist, that's going to make women like you less. So as much as you can, changing your outlook on women will help as well. So what we've discussed so far, to recap: looks maxing, if it can work for you, is worth pursuing. And I think that many would be surprised at how far it can take them. Personality is hard to change, but mental health disorders are treatable, or at least manageable to an extent in many cases. And I'm not being flippant about this. I've had mental health struggles that would be much more serious than people would expect based on my public profile, right? So it's been a nightmare getting treatment, but you can treat it through therapy and, if necessary, medication. And then maybe there's some therapeutic management for autism. I'm not so sure about that. Changing your political beliefs. And then the final thing really is, frankly, and this would be something that all the red pill gurus would advise. They're not wrong about everything. And one thing they're right about is that you should be chasing status, right? The most direct way is by obtaining resources, but mating success is also predicted by education level, right? So they've done, and people say that on dating apps, the only thing that matters is looks. Well, looks might matter most, but even getting putting a higher level of education on your dating profiles will get more results. So that's something that's attractive. But status from basically anywhere, status from being good at anything will help. So, and I think that wraps up my advice. I think I've spoken quite a bit. So I'll let you weigh in.
So I kind of backdoored some of that. But I gotta be honest, I probably copped out on a lot of what you said here in my video, which will lead me to my question coming in a second, um, as to why and like what that means and how you feel about the why there. One thing I did though I think was useful is I talk about hobbies, and that like I recognize status as a thing. And so like with some of these guys, you maybe just want to be the best cosplayer in your city. Like little things like that can provide you with way more attractiveness points than you think. I think men who display a passion for a thing, I think that could be interpreted as status. Uh, I I joined a fraternity in college. Black fraternities have a different cultural significance. It doesn't quite look like what you imagine, like the frat boy thing, but it has a similar function to esteem you to a certain population of women to say, "Ooh, he's a blank, blank, blank." So I'm going to give him more attention and energy. So yeah, there's a lot there. But I definitely propose excuse me. Wow, I'm really struggling uh hydration right now. But finding hobbies that you are passionate about, for one, because it'll hopefully give you an excuse to pull out of these communities. And for two, if you're smart and you pick a hobby that involves women, plants, you know what I'm saying, cooking, you'll also create an environment where your dating market will be a little specialized. You'll have something that you and a person can connect on, and then suddenly everything becomes easier. But that was just the one thing that was the one thing I think we had synergy on. But if I'm honest, I played only minimal lip service to the hard truths you just presented about the reality that at a baseline, as you said, what you said, facts are friendly. I like that phrase. The incels in this community have an accurate understanding of the problem that they face and the solutions. They just don't have an accurate, or they struggle with pursuing those, as opposed to just getting sucked into um constantly, bickering on Twitter and social media.
Yeah, I would just jump in. I'm gonna obviously let you keep speaking, but just to make sure that my opinion is clear, you said that they have an accurate perception. I would say that they have an exaggerated perception of accurate baseline facts. So I
Yeah,
would say looks matter, right? And they would say not looks are the only thing that matters. That would be a bit of a caricature, but they would say that it's definitely the number one thing. And if you're ugly, you're just screwed, right?
right.
And this is very well illustrated by characters like, I mean, anyone listening who's not an incel, especially, I don't know how much my audience is almost entirely women. So if they're coming here, then they'll be able to verify this pretty easily. And I've heard that your audience is also mostly women, but
That's
I don't know if
completely
that's
untrue.
that's completely untrue.
Completely
Okay, I
untrue. I'll
clicked on
come
one
back
of
to
your
that.
videos, and at the start, you were addressing that as a criticism. I
Yeah,
was
well,
like,
no,
oh,
the
shared. I was
joke
like, shared
was,
criticism. I get that as well.
yeah, yeah. Oh,
But in
so
any
you have,
case,
yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry. I'll keep
yeah,
cutting
yeah,
you
yeah.
off.
So I saw you addressing that critique that you were pandering to black women,
Yes.
and I was like, oh, I get the same critique all the time. Sick. So that was comforting. But in my case, it's partially true that it's like, well, I know that from my TikTok demographics, it is mostly women. I think that's largely just because TikTok is mostly women, but I
Probably.
digress. But for women listening, you can very easily look up Elliot Rogers, right? Or Elliot Roger, the I can't remember if it's Rogers or Rogers. That's quite embarrassing.
Roger.
But he's yeah, Elliot Roger. Thank you. He's one of the most notorious incels ever, right? He's one of the very few incel terrorists. This guy is going to be better looking than at least one of your ex-boyfriends, right? I'm not saying that he's handsome. I am saying that he has many conventional markers for physical attractiveness. So their idea, and I'm not denying his status as an incel, I'm just saying that the reason he was not able to find someone on the mating market, it wasn't just his looks, right? That it's a combination of factors. And that unfortunately will be true for many of them. Anyway,
Mm.
that was a much longer interruption than I
No,
planned.
no,
Please let
no,
me
it's
mute my
fine.
microphone and you
No,
can
no,
continue.
actually, we can just jump in there, which is the reason why I kind of pulled my punch, which actually wouldn't have been a punch, it would have been a handout or a call in, is because the the attention economy that I operate in is not overly friendly to sympathy for the devil, right? They're not overly the strong market move is to just dunk on and debunk incels from where I stand in the attention economy. Whereas I would argue more ethical and truest response is to call in, provide real facts, critique, analyze, but also humanize on some level. And so there's a danger involved, especially from a men's from a men's standpoint, to uh humanizing and and still manning inceldom and manosphere elements to any extent. Even when they're sitting there with like legitimate research, they're exaggerating it, right? They're misrepresenting it, but to tell the truth, looks maxing, increasing your status, all those things we mentioned, these are not new phenomenon. They're not untrue. They're well researched and well um, uh, supported by history. The question becomes, and this may be useful for you. You may have a really good perspective on this as a creator who has a strong women audience. Is how should women respond to not how should, because that becomes very prescriptive and it's really getting us in trouble. How might or what considerations do you see coming from women when we step into this space to talk about these issues scientifically and critically, but not ideologically, right? Does that make sense? I want this to not be overly sympathetic to incels, but I do want it to be critical of the incel dunking economy and all that kind of connects around that. Like, how do you say, yes, X, Y, and Z incel talking points are based in reality, and also not evoke the wrath of, feminists, possibly radical feminists. I know I'm going to get some radical feminist heat for this video, but it's fine. I don't really rock with them. Like, how do you kind of manage that conflict?
I think that if I'm 100% honest and I stick to the facts, then I just feel insulated from all of that sort of criticism.
Mhm.
I know where my heart is, and I know that what I'm saying is at least what I believe to be true. And so any critique of me, it's not, I'm going to take it on board and I'm going to look at it and I'm going to do as you say. Like, it's like, what I said true? But what are we really saying here? I mean, I think part of it comes from the fact that when we say the word incel, a bunch of different images come to mind, right? Images of virulent, misogynist, racist right wingers who kill people, right? That image comes to mind. And if that's the image that comes to mind, then yeah, any ounce of sympathy will be met with vitriol and mocking. And I think that that's fair enough. It's like, that's your perspective. And so you thought that I was saying one thing that I wasn't. And I don't have time to sift through the YouTube comments. I mean, I'm now concerned that this is going to be edited in such a way, because you said at the start, I have the look. So if you just edit me right, it's going to seem like I'm a hero, a folk hero to the incels. They don't like me, right? To be clear, this isn't a group that likes me at all.
Right.
So I recognize that some of the things I've said could be taken out of context. But
well, no, I just want to be clear. I'm definitely not going to do that, and I think that's important because the struggle I have is we shouldn't fear that. That's the critique. Yeah, I do. To be honest, I do fear that because there's stakes in it, right? There's stakes in the economy of this is how I pay my bills and feed my children. You're just dabbling. Like I'm 10 toes deep in this world.
I would say that going into any discussion such as this, we should try to show up as the most compassionate and empathetic versions of ourselves. And it's very easy to become single-minded and say, oh, this is, this is an incredibly misogynistic group. They should all rot in hell, right? It's a little more complicated than that. There are about 20,000 members of incel forums, it seems, which is not very many people. Most of them don't post, right? So most of them are not posting. And then there's pretty high traffic on the incel forums from people who are non-members, right? So this is a big group that you're only hearing from the posters, which is a tiny group, right? And you're seeing that they are virulent misogynists. And so you're casting away all of them. But two things can be true at once, I guess. One, the misogyny is horrifying. It's a legitimate threat, right? And, incel terrorism, the small portion of incels who are violent are legitimately threatening and cause for concern. Two, it is very difficult to be a physically unattractive, autistic, mentally ill, poor man on the mating market. And I don't see any contradiction between those two things. And I also don't see any pragmatic contradiction in saying, hey, misogyny is very bad. You should let go of those beliefs. Also, you should work on your mental health, and you should hit the gym, and you should try to get a job and move out if you can. All those things can be true, right?
Yeah. I wish it was so simple. I wish it was so simple. And
I think it is. And
it is.
I think that the people who are making it more simple are the people who are just saying, oh, they should all rot in hell. And it's like, all right, good luck with that. Enjoy never fixing the problem.
I mean, that's so true. I really would like your critique if you were to watch my Manosphere series. It's 3 videos, and I talk Peterson, etc. And it's based a lot on the research I got from spree shooters. Because I kind of get at a lot of that. And it's just it's a frustrating reality in a lot of ways, because I don't get a lot of pushback. And that might be because I told the line maybe more than I need to, but I do have a predominantly male audience. That was the kind of the bait and switch of that video toward the beginning, is that the reality is I have a very large male audience, considering what I spend a lot of time talking about. And I don't get a ton of critique from people, feminists or like the left wing, other than like, just general bad faith actors. I don't get a lot of good faith critiques about my rhetoric. But I am looking to have this video be more challenging overall, because I feel like there's more room for growth than has happened in these conversations.
Well, I think I think another thing is that we've talked about incels a lot specifically. To be clear, that's the most sympathetic group, right? Of the manosphere, right? Well, maybe men's rights activists, but
no, that's real. But it's funny though. I'm sorry.
Incels versus like the guys who are following Fresh and Fit. I don't think that Fresh and Fit is even popular among incels. So we can talk about the manosphere and we can talk about it as one chunk, but in terms of my feelings about them, right, I have much less sympathy for, the red-pilled playboy who's using and abusing women deliberately and manipulatively. That no sympathy at all, no patience for it. And very different from someone from a young man who has been discriminated against, frankly, on the mating market severely and has almost no recourse. Those are two very different people. One of them I have no sympathy for. It's just not happening in my brain, right? These are men who have gone through a bad divorce or have gotten their heart broken once or twice, and instead of
severe lack of resilience.
Instead of handling it productively, they went off the rails. Very different from an incel who is fundamentally, in many cases, just going to be a lonely man with a personality disorder.
Yeah. And that's so funny though. Not funny, but like profound, maybe. because we flattened the discourse. All these groups, there's no perfect enemies anymore. That's why, like, in the 90s, every action movie, it was, brown skinned terrorists. And then by the time you get to the mid 2000s, like, well, maybe making all the enemies of Arnold Schwarzenegger terrorists in the Middle East isn't responsible with, ethically speaking. But boy, these incels, these white supremacist terrorist incels, who's really gonna stick up for them? You know what I'm saying? These to catch a predator guys, and don't get me wrong, I get why. There's no real recourse for that, but there is a psychological function that serves that I wish it was safer to talk about. But I'm not gonna do it, and I'm not. This isn't going in the video. You know what I'm saying? So it's an interesting dynamic. I need to go. I'm getting pinged for. I think I'm finally clear for my video, but I need to respond to some people. This is great. I really appreciate this time. Thank you so much. Can I label you? Can I make the joke about Dark Triad chat? I just think that's hilarious, and I'm
Yes.
going to
Yeah.
put
Yeah.
that
Sure.
under your name at some point. Just because I think that's the funniest thing I can do in between the heaviness of this conversation.
Yes.
You
Sure.
should,
No,
if you
I'm
ever
very
want
comfortable with
to,
that joke.
yeah, if you ever want to
As long as
come,
it's clear that it's not self-proclaimed,
yeah,
I'll take it. Yeah.
yeah, that should be your name on TikTok. Like, stop calling you. Like, if you want to separate you as the academic, and you as the content creator, Mac and Murphy, Dr. Mac and Murphy, evolutionary psychologist. Yeah. And then, like, on TikTok, Dark Triad Chad. That is,
Yeah.
they're
I'm
such
not a doctor
creative
though.
people.
Be careful. I'm not a
Oh,
doctor yet.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Knocking on
Okay.
wood for you. I've been told I finished my comps and then went viral, and I was like, yeah, fuck that.